Page 518 continued. Modern criticism. Modern literary criticism consists of a synthesis of the traditional and the experimental. The historical criticism survives in the works of professors and scholars like David Cecil, Cecil, C.M. Boura, Boura, Ifor, Ifor, Evans, etc. The moral concerns of Arnold are to be seen in the critical creeds of D.H. Lawrence and Middleton Murray. The new critics have opened new vistas. T.S. Eliot remarks, quote, ... the psychological and sociological are probably the two best advertised varieties of modern criticism, but P capital, number of ways in which the problems of criticism are approached was never before so great or so confusing, ... Criticism seems to have separated into several diverse kinds, ... unquote. 1. T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot is the greatest and most influential critic of the modern age. He is like Dryden because most of his criticism is written in the form of prefaces to his works with the purpose of justifying his own poetic creations. Eliot's famous works are The Use of Poetry and the Use of Criticism, 1933, The Idea of a Christian Society, 1939, Notes Towards the Definition of Culture, 1939, Notes Towards the Definition of Culture, 1948, Selected Essays, 3rd edition, 1951, On Poetry and Poet, 1957, To Criticize the Critic, 1966, and The Secret Wood. Para. As a critic, Eliot speaks with authority and conviction. He had the rare gift of expressing his thought in lucid, striking, pointed, and trenchant phrases as, quote, dissociation of sensibility, unquote, objective correlative, quote, tradition and individual talent, unquote, etc. In order to understand Eliot's criticism, it is essential to examine some of his critical concepts. Page 519. Para. Objective correlative. It is one of the most important critical concepts of Eliot. It exerted a great influence on the critical temper of the 20th century. He formulated this doctrine in his famous essay entitled Hamlet and His Problems. Eliot believes that since the poet cannot transfer his emotions on ideas from his own mind directly to his readers, there must be some kind of mediation. Quote, a set of objects, a situation, chain of events which shall be the formula of that particular emotion, such that when the external facts, which must dominate in sensory experience, the emotion is immediately evoked, unquote, It is through, quote, objective correlative, unquote, that the transactions between the author and the reader necessarily takes place. What Eliot means by this doctrine is that a great work of art is nothing but a set of conceptual symbols or correlatives which endeavor to express the emotions of the poet, and these symbols constitute the total vision of the creative artist. In this manner, quote, what the author has to say is objectified, unquote, and the critic's job is to examine the shape and character of this object. Eliot illustrates the objective correlative from Hamlet and Macbeth. The sleepwalking scene in Macbeth expressed Lady Macbeth's mental condition through a set of sensory facts. Candle, perfumes of Arabia, smell of blood, unclean spot, and we readers immediately get a vivid picture of her emotional and mental state. There is no object, character, situation or incident which adequately expresses the inner anguish of Hamlet. Shakespeare has failed to find a suitable, quote, objective correlative, unquote, for the emotion he wanted to convey. Herein is the real source of the artistic failure of Hamlet. Printing mistake. Herein is the real source of the artistic failure of Hamlet. Para. Eliot uses the phrase objective correlative to explain how emotion can be best expressed in poetry. It implies that greater emphasis should be laid upon the work of art itself as a structure. Eliot observes that it is, quote, not our feelings, but the pattern which we make of our feelings is the center of value, unquote, stop. He believes that in great poetry, thoughts and feelings are presented, quote, by a statement of events in human action, of objects in the external world, unquote, stop, para. Dissociation of sensibility. This phrase occurs in Eliot's essay entitled The Metaphysical Poets. He uses this phrase to describe the characteristic fault of later 17th century poetry. The opposite of this phrase is, quote, unification of sensibility, unquote, which according to Eliot means, quote, a direct sensuous apprehension of thought, a recreation of thought into feelings, unquote, stop. Such fusion of thought and feeling is good for poetry. Bad poetry results when there is, quote, dissociation of sensibility, unquote, that is, the poet's inability to feel his thoughts. In good poetry, which represents, quote, unification of sensibility, unquote, thought is transformed into feeling to steal its way into the reader's heart. It is this union of the two which constitutes poetic sensibility. When the poet is unable to convert his thought into feeling, the result is, quote, dissociation of sensibility, unquote, a split between thought and poetry, and the result is bad poetry. A poet may have best ideas to communicate, but they serve no purpose unless they are expressed as feelings. Para. A unified sensibility, according to Eliot, is the true product of a true synthesis of the individual with the traditional, of feelings with thought, and of temporal with the eternal. The tradition of unified sensibility was disrupted in the 17th century as a result of a split in the creative personality of the artist, for which Eliot applied the term, quote, dissociation of sensibility, unquote, stop, para. By sensibility, Eliot does not merely mean feeling or the capacity to receive some impressions. By it he means a synthetic faculty which can amalgamate and unite thought and feeling, which can fuse into a single whole the varied and disparate, often opposite and contradictory experiences, the sensuous and the intellectual. Para. The Elizabethans and Jacobeans had developed a unifying sensibility. Such a remarkable fusion of thought and feeling is found in Downes' Downe'' poetry, as well as in much modern poetry. After Downe and Herbert, the poet lost the capacity of unifying thought and feeling. The concept of the unification of feeling was lost, and, quote, dissociation, unquote, of feeling set in. The poets of the 18th century were intellectuals. They thought but did not feel. The romantics of the 19th century felt but did not think. Para. Tradition and individual talent. Eliot's essay Tradition and Individual Talent, first published in Times Literary Supplement in 1919, may be regarded as an unofficial manifesto of Eliot's critical creed. This essay illustrates Eliot's faith in classicism and tradition. In his poetry, he achieved an elegance and a dignity absent from the popular and pretentious verse of the Romantic poets. Page 520. A true classicist must have some faith in some system of writing, and that a work of art must conform to the past tradition. He differs from the neoclassicists who believe that the writer must follow rules of the ancients and that poetry must be didactic. By, quote, conformity to tradition, unquote, Eliot means, quote, a way that alters the tradition as much as it is directed by it, unquote, stop. Thus, tradition and individual talent go together. The essay Tradition and Individual Talent is divided into three parts. 1. Conception of tradition. 2. Impersonal theory of poetry. And 3. Conclusion. Para. Significance and definition of tradition. English people regard tradition as a word of censure. They are accustomed to praise a poet's work for individual and original aspects. Eliot observes that if they examine the matter critically, they will realize that the best and most individual part of a poet's work is that which shows the maximum influence of the writers of the past. Quote, whereas if we approach a poet without this prejudice, we shall often find that not only the best, but the most individual parts of his work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously, unquote, stop. Tradition and individual talent are inseparable. Para. Tradition is not imitating the ways of the ancients blindly. Tradition can only be obtained by those who have the historical sense, which involves a perception, quote, not only of the pastness of the past, but also of its present, stop. One who has the historic sense feels that the whole of literature of Europe, from Homer down to his own day, including the literature of his own country, forms one continuous literary tradition, unquote, stop. Tradition represents the accumulated wisdom and experience of ages, and so its knowledge is essential for really great and noble achievements. Quote, tradition is the means by which the vitality of the past enriches the life of the present, unquote, stop. In brief, the sense of tradition implies 1. Recognition of the continuity of literature, 2. A critical judgment as to which of the writers of the past continue to be significant in the present, and 3. A knowledge of these writers through painstaking effort. Para. The writer has to repress his individuality while taking from tradition. Quote, the progress of an artist is a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality, unquote, stop. The past and the present fuse in a work into a new compound. Para. The impersonal theory of poetry. In Tradition and Individual Talent, Eliot stated, quote, the poet has not a personality to express, but a particular medium, which is not only a medium and not a personality, in which impressions and experiences combine in peculiar, unexpected ways. Stop. Impressions and experiences which are important for the man may take no place in the poetry, and those which become important in the poetry may play quite a negligible part in the man, the personality. Unquote. Stop. Eliot holds that the poet and the poem are two separate things. He writes in the introduction to the 1928 edition of The Sacred Wood, quote, "We can only say that a poem in some sense has its own life, that its parts form a body of neatly ordered biographical data, that the feeling, or emotions, or vision, resulting from the poem is something different from the feeling or emotion or vision of the poet." Unquote. Stop. Para. Eliot elucidates the theory of the impersonality of poetry by examining first, quote, "the relation of the poet to the past," unquote, and next, quote, "the relation of the poem to its author," unquote. Stop. The author must allow his poetic sensibility to be shaped and modified by the past. He must continue to acquire the sense of tradition through his career. In the beginning, his individuality may assert itself, but as his powers mature, there must be greater and greater extinction of personality. The artistic process is a process of depersonalization. An artist must surrender himself to the creative work. Eliot remarks, quote, "The progress of an artist is a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality." Stop. The poet's or the artist's personality is merely a medium, having the same significance as a catalytic agent, or a receptacle in which chemical reactions take place. Unquote. Stop. So Eliot holds that, quote, "honest criticism and sensitive appreciation is directed not upon the poet but upon the poetry." Unquote. Stop. The poet, according to Eliot, has no personality to express. He is merely a medium to express impressions and experiences in peculiar and unexpected ways. Impressions and experiences which are important for the man find no place in his poetry, and those which become important in the poetry may have no significance for the man. Para. Eliot rejects Wordsworth's theory of poetry having, quote, "its origin in emotions recollected in tranquility." Unquote. Stop. He points out that in the process of poetic composition, there is neither emotion nor recollection nor tranquility. In poetic process, there is only concentration of a number of experiences, and a new thing results from this concentration. Page 521. Eliot concludes, quote, "Party is not a turning loose of emotion." Printing mistake, I think it should be poetry. Quote, "Poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion, colon. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality." Unquote. Stop. Poetry is a depersonalized organization of the poet's emotions and feelings. It is not inspiration. Para. T.S. Eliot is a critic. T.S. Eliot is the most influential of all critics. He has corrected and educated the taste of his readers and has thrown a fresh light on the function of poetry and the nature of poetic process. As a critic, Eliot is a classicist whose role model is Aristotle. He found scientific temper and rational inquiry lacking in contemporary criticism. He calls himself a classicist in literature, but he has no kinship with neoclassical critics of the 18th century. He boldly deprecates the neoclassical practice of ampulating an author, quote, by the canons of dead critics, unquote, comma, for, quote, to conform merely would be for the new work and not really to conform at all, comma, it would not be new, comma, and therefore, comma, would not be a work of art, unquote, stop. In art, as in life, the past and the present act and react on each other. So the past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. Eliot does not accept didacticism or any other use of poetry as a necessary condition of poetic art. To him, poetry is, quote, an amusement, unquote, comma, quote, a superior amusement, unquote, stop. Para. He applies the method of science to the study of literature so that the critic may be able to see it as it really is. This is his most remarkable contribution to literary criticism. A critic must follow objective standards. Instead of following merely his inner voice, he must conform to tradition. A sense of tradition, a respect for order and authority, is at the core of Eliot's classicism. In this respect, his essay, Tradition and Individual Talent, is the manifesto of his critical creed. Para. Eliot has rendered great service to literature by reforming taste and revitalizing literature. He has formulated a number of new critical concepts which have exercised great influence on criticism ever since. Objective correlative dissociation of sensibility, unification of sensibility are only a few of his critical concepts which have imparted both catholicity and rationalism to literary criticism. Quote, Eliot's theory of impersonality of poetry, unquote, says A. G. George, comma, quote, is the greatest history on the nature of the poetic process after Wordsworth's romantic conception of poetry, unquote, stop. Estimating Eliot's achievement as a critic, George Watson remarks, colon, quote, he has made criticism look different, but in no single sense. He has offered a new range of rhetorical possibilities, comma, confirmed it in its increasing contempt for historical processes, comma, and yet reshaped its nation of period by a handful of brilliant intuitions, unquote, stop. 2. I. A. Richards, Richards. I. A. Richards, the pioneer of new criticism, is one of the major critics of the 20th century. His major critical works are Principles of Literary Criticism, 1924, Practical Criticism, 1929, and Coleridge on Imagination, 1935. He also wrote The Foundation of Aesthetics, 1922, in collaboration with C.K. Ogden and James Wood, and The Meaning of Meaning, 1923, with Ogden. Para. Richards is the first critic who realized the importance of psychology and the impact it made on the reader and society. Psychology is the, quote, indispensable instrument for this inquiry, unquote, stop. He defines a poem as a collection of experiences of an artist. No single experience can make a poem. It is, quote, a class of more or less similar experiences, unquote, that forms a poem. Richard writes, quote, a poem is a class of experiences which do not differ in any character more than a certain amount, comma, vary for each character, comma, from a standard experience, stop. We may take this as standard experience, comma, the relevant experience of the poet when contemplating the completed composition, unquote, stop, para. Richards is admired for the originality of ideas. He has made substantial and lasting contribution to the growth and development of the new criticism. His famous book, The Principles of Literary Criticism, has popularized him as an eminent psychologist and aesthetician. In it, he has enunciated the theory of the value of art and has formulated the modern aesthetic school. Georgie Watson writes, quote, Richards' claim to have pioneered Anglo-American new criticism of the 30s and 40s is unassailable. He provided the theoretical foundations on which the technique of verbal analysis was built, unquote, stop, para. Richard turned criticism into science. He deftly applied the methods of scientific investigation to literary judgment. He also considered an adequate knowledge of psychology as an essential preliminary to literary criticism. He also gives paramount importance to the art of communication and brings out a distinction between the scientific and emotive uses of language. According to Richards, poetry represents a certain systematization of and experiences of the poet. Page 522. Richard inspired a host of followers. The most outstanding among them is William Empson, E-M-P-S-O-N. 3. F. R. Lewis, L-E-A-V-I-S. F. R. Lewis was, quote, the most influential British-born critic of the 20th century, unquote, stop. His famous works are New Bearing in English Poetry, 1932, Revaluation, 1936, The Great Tradition, 1948, and The Common Pursuit, 1952. He also wrote for Continuity, 1933, Education and the University, 1944, D. H. Lawrence, Novelist, 1955, and he also edited a quarterly review, Scrutiny, from May 1932 to October 1953. Para. Lewis was influenced by T.S. Eliot and I.A. Richards. Lawrence Lerner calls Lewis a, quote, practical critic, unquote, who employs the technique of analytic criticism. He adds, quote, the achievement of scrutiny is, comma, in a way, comma, peculiar to the 20th century, comma. It is the building up of a body of practical criticisms, comma, of substantiated literary judgment, comma, that has surely no equal in extent and quality, unquote, stop. Lewis's criticism is often based on the response of his students to the classroom. He was highly influenced by Eliot's The Sacred Wood. Para. Lewis's view on literature is quite comprehensive. Its purpose is to elevate, quote, human living, unquote, or culture. His primary concern is culture, quote, a way of living, comma, ordered and patterned in accordance with some ideal of a civilized community, unquote, stop. In Culture and Environment, he writes that these ideals have degenerated in industrial age because in it the tasks and habits of people are formed by films, newspapers, advertisements, popular fiction, all of which in their self-interest exploit, quote, the cheapest emotional responses, unquote, of the people. The citizens should be trained to discriminate between true culture and false and to resist the latter. Para. It is this function which literature at its best discharges. It is, quote, the share house of recorded values, unquote, stop. In the works of the best writers of the quintessence of the nation's culture, the best both of its past and present is communicated to the future. Para. Like Eliot, Lewis is also believed in the importance of tradition in literature. A critic's aim is to study the past and notice a continuous development and the union of the past and the present. Lewis points out in the the great tradition, that tradition is very significant in the works of Jane Austen, George Eliot, Henry James, Joseph Conrad, and D.H. Lawrence. Para. Lewis has evolved a critical idiom in which he expresses his views with precision and exactness. Enactment and realization are two important words in his critical vocabulary. The former implies that good poetry embodies or enacts a valuation of a reality at once inner, spiritual, and outer, social and sensuous. It is a mode of self-expression and of self-recognition. Reality and sincerity are essential both in creation and criticism. Para. Lewis's main concern is with emotion in poetry and its association with concreteness. He, like Eliot, does not believe in depersonalization in poetry. Personal emotions are realized in concrete details of the poem, and thus they are distanced and universalized. Lewis believes that poetry is the expression of an integrated person. He also advocates the presence of the ethical quality in literature. Para. The following stages are found in Lewis's critical practice. A. A complete response to the work in hand. B. Its close scrutiny or analysis. C. And judgment of significance. Para. Lewis's most remarkable contribution to criticism is the relation he establishes between it and, quote, an interest in man, comma, society and civilization, unquote, stop. Literature, comma, which does not enrich man's cultural heritage, comma, does not belong to, quote, the great tradition, unquote, stop. Para. John Crow Ransom, R-A-N-S-O-M. Para. As we have already pointed out at the very outset, it was Ransom who, with his book, The New Criticism 1941, gave a name to the critical movement we are discussing at present. He laid special stress on distinguishing between the language of science and the language of poetry. Science works with concepts and what he called, quote, pure symbols, unquote. Poetry, on the contrary, works with images or, quote, iconic signs, unquote, stop. A poetic image cannot be grasped intellectually. If it gets grasped, it is not the image but an, quote, idea, unquote, of the image. An image or, quote, iconic sign, unquote, is concrete and amenable to sensuous perception, but it cannot be conceptualized. In The World's Body, Ransom again dwells on the qualitative difference between the poetic and the scientific approach and priorities. The poet is concerned with what Ransom calls the, quote, bodiness, unquote, of the world. The scientist, on the contrary, looks at the, quote, skeleton, unquote, of the world. He prefers what he calls, quote, physical, unquote, poetry to that of the, quote, platonic, unquote, kind, which even when at times overtly physical always leads to facile concepts. Para. Page 523. Ransom's distinction between structure and texture was also very vital for the new critics. A literary work has an overall structure, but texture is local and consists of a variety of verbal and figural elements such as image, irony, paradox, and other rhetorical elements which take away the reader's attention from the structure to themselves and there impede the flow of the discourse by overlooking the structure. Scientific discourse has no texture, only structure. Structure, according to Ransom, may be conceptualized but not texture. Para. Alan Tate, T-A-T-E, and Clean Brooks. As Pic Rylance, R-Y-L-N-C, points out, Ransom's concept of the interaction between the structure and the texture of a poem, quote, is a significant feature of all new critical analysis, unquote, stop. Later new critics like Tate and Brooks chipped in with a little variation. Tate, for example, emphasized, quote, tension in poetry, unquote, stop. Tension is derived from the two terms extension and intention. Extension, going out, is the literal meaning and intention is the metaphorical meaning. Tension is the simultaneous existence of these two kinds of meaning, which cannot be verbalized in logical or discursive terms. Brooks dwelt forcefully on metaphor, irony, and paradox as the ever-present elements in the texture of a poem which make the paraphrase of a poem impossible. He attacked what he called the, quote, heresy of paraphrase, unquote. Ransom had admitted that a poem had structure, a discursive paraphrasable element. Brooks altogether dismisses the possibility of paraphrase. The texture of a poem integrated with its structure in an organic whole makes itself its own meaning, its, quote, paraphrase, unquote, stop. To quote Brooks, quote, the imagery and the rhythm are not merely the instruments by which this fancied core of the meaning which can be expressed in a paraphrase is directly rendered, unquote, stop. They are also the meaning of the poem. Here Brooks is out ransoming ransom, exclamation. Para, R.P. Blackmore, BLSCKMUR, and William Empson. Blackmore is closer to Tate than Ransom in demanding that the structure of a poem must be rationally conceived and its parts must be related more or less schematically. All great poets such as Dante were extremely intelligent and rational, not neurotics or psychotic. Para, William Empson showed remarkable acumen and vigor in linguistic analysis of poetry. In his 7 Types of Ambiguity, 1930, he dwelt on the use of ambiguity in poetry which makes all poetic statements plurisignificant and tantalizingly meaningful. Ambiguity is a positive value, not a product of sloppiness. Empson defines ambiguity as, quote, any verbal nuance, however slight, which gives room for alternative reactions to the same piece of language, unquote, stop. From 7 Types, Empson emerges as a true blue and redoubtable new critic, a champion of close reading and a practitioner of the same. However, later on he significantly changed his critical stance, leaving no room for ambiguity, stop. In the Structure of Complex Words, 1951, he deplored the kind of reading which he had advocated 2 decades earlier. He completely turned against the central formulation of new criticism. He now came round to the view that sheer multiplicity of meanings or ambiguity does not make for value. He gave much importance to the questions of faith and ideology. He was an out-and-out anti-Christian, while most, if not all, new critics were Orthodox Christians, and most importantly, he rejected the new critical, quote, heresy of paraphrase, unquote, and himself paraphrased some poems and parts of poems, much to the chagrin of the new critics. He wanted poetry to be accountable to reason and the actualities of human life, rather than a pack of pseudo-statements meant for aesthetic pleasure or some remote psychological satisfaction. Conclusion. With Empson, new criticism had come full circle, but it had done its job. The new critics are to be praised for their espousal of the close reading of analytical criticism. They checked the impressionistic tendency of making vague and general remarks about literary works. They went all out to grapple with the linguistic intricacies of poems. Their actual practice of literary analysis proved very enriching for their readers and the readers to come. However, their insistence on examining every poem in a vacuum, completely detaching it from its autobiographic, historical, and ideological matrices, did not go down well with many readers. A poem has a signature, but the new critics read every poem as if it was anonymous. What we are recounting here are not the quote defects unquote of new criticism, but the essential features which make new criticism. The new critics performed a great historic service in the field of literary studies, and they must be given their due. They had a manifesto of exercising some critical course, and they accomplished it right. Page 524. Contemporary criticism. The new criticism. The new criticism is supposed to be a specifically American movement, but it was pioneered by T.S. Eliot and I.A. Richards. Eliot's famous remark that, quote, a poem's existence is somewhere between the writer and the term new criticism came into general use after the publication of John Crow Ransom's book, The New Criticism, in 1941. It is a revolutionary critical movement which is not concerned with the sociological or historical aspects of the age in which the particular poetry is written. George Watson writes, quote, in the American New Critics, contempt for the late 19th century values is general, not only for historical criticism and its accompanying pedantries, but for agnostic enlightenment, democratic optimism, industrialism, and such international ideals as Marxism, unquote. It is a frankly reactionary movement, and the word now must always have held for it an air of pleasant paradox. Famous critics of this school are J. C. Ransom, R. P. Blackmure, Alan Ted, Clent Brooks, Robert Penn Warren, and William K. Wimsatt, Wimsatt. In the preface to the anthology Understanding Poetry, the editors of Clent Brooks and Robert Penn Warren condemned the use of poetry for any purpose beyond itself, whether historical or moralistic. They asserted that, quote, if poetry is worth teaching at all, it is worth teaching as poetry, unquote, stop. Rennie Wallach and Austin Warren in Theory of Literature, 1949, Alan Tate in The Man of Letters in the Modern World, 1955, and Robert Penn Warren in Selected Aces, 1958, are strikingly indifferent to historical probability. Basic principles of the new criticism. 1. A poem or a work of art should be treated as an object in itself, primarily as poetry and not as any other thing. In analyzing and evaluating a work, they usually do not refer to the author's biography, to contemporary social conditions, and to its psychological or moral effects on the reader. The literary critic must approach the work with an open mind, ready to study it, quote, as it is in itself, unquote, stop. 2. The new critics are mainly concerned with the study of words and the structure of poetry. The distinctive procedure of new criticism is explication, or close reading, the detailed and subtle analysis of the complex interrelations and ambiguities of the component elements within a work. The new critics derive their explicative procedure from I.A. Richards' Practical Criticism, 1929, and William Empson's 7 Types of Ambiguity, 1930. 3. Poetry is communication and language is the means of communication. So, the new critics seek to understand the full meaning of a poem through a study of poetic language. To them, words are very important, and their study is the only key to the poetic meaning of the poem. The key concepts of this criticism deal with the meanings and interactions of words, figures of speech, and symbols. There is a great emphasis on, quote, the organic unity, unquote, of structure and meaning. 4. The new critics reacted sharply against the vulgarization of meaning by the rhetoric of mass communication or privatization of language as a means of communication. According to Alan Tate, poetry is not mere communication of ideas or attitude. It is a complex patterning of meaning to be read and appreciated as such. J.C. Ransom draws a distinction between the texture and the structure of poetry. The texture is the quality of the expression enriched by every kind of appropriate metaphorical device so as to embody the full quality of the things being referred to. The structure is the paraphrasable argument. R.P. Blackmure investigated the ways in which ideas can be absorbed by craft into poetic meaning and the relationship between ideas, imagination, and craftsmanship. Wimsatt and Brooke write in The Verbal Icon, quote, a poem should not mean but be, stop. A poem can be only through its meaning, since its medium is words, yet it is, simply is, in the sense that we have no excuse for inquiring what part is intended or meant. Poetry is a feat of style by which a complex of meaning is handled all at once, unquote, stop, para. Each critic of this group has devised his own method to bring out the uniqueness of the poem and check the vulgarization of language. Richards his, quote, emotive and referential meanings, unquote. Eliot his, quote, objective correlative, unquote. Brooks his, quote, paradox, unquote. And Warren his, quote, irony, unquote, stop, para. The fullest accounts of the doctrines of the new criticism appeared as late as 1946 to 49 in two articles in Serwane, Serwane Review by W.K. Wimsatt Jr. and M.C. Beardsley, Beardsley, The International Fallacy and the Affective Fallacy, both collected in Wimsatt's The Verbal Icon, 1954. Page 525, para. The new critics reduced all poetry to a formula. They removed criticism into a highly specialized technical area where it cannot be read or appreciated by the ordinary man. It has also ignored the relation of life to literature. Para. Commenting on the contribution of the new critics, Richard remarks, quote, ... their contribution upon linguistic expression has benefited the study of poetry, stop. Readers needed to realize that the poem is the thing, unquote, stop. They taught a generation to read, to reflect on meaning, to pay attention to what a work of literary art really means. They tell us that literature is how it works, and that is a remarkable achievement. Para. The Chicago Critics. A reaction against the new critics began under the leadership of Ronald S. Crane, C-R-A-N-E, in the late 30s. This group of critics is known as Chicago School of Neo-Aristotelians, who, according to George Watson, employed, quote, a more formidable scholarship and a less popular style, comma, insisted upon a return to questions of design and structure by whatever method and upon whatever assumption seemed appropriate to the particular case, unquote, stop. The Chicago view, according to Crane himself, was, quote, pluralistic and instrumentalist, unquote, insisting that, quote, we must accord to critics the right of free choice as between different basic methods, unquote, stop, para. The Chicago critics are so called because they all worked at the University of Chicago and formed a homogeneous group with little difference in their views and critical methods. The main characteristics of this school may be summed up as pluralism and neo-Aristotelianism. The most explicit statements of their pluralism are contained in McKeown's The Philosophic Basis of Art and Criticism, Jason's An Outline of Poetic Theory, and Crane's The Language of Criticism and Structure of Poetry. They took special interest in Aristotle's Poetics. Commenting on the method of Chicago critics, Pritchard, Pritchard, writes, quote, "Far from proclaiming a new critical panacea, the Chicago critics urged the application to literature of varied critical procedures, their purpose being to understand the work of art, they being to bear upon it whatever they believe will serve to elucidate it, no matter whence it may be derived, Critical principles ... are simply instruments of inquiry and analysis, unquote,